Great. Well, I'm very excited today to have with me Peter Williams. Welcome to the stream.
Great to be with you.
You're the principal of Tyndale House, and you do all sorts of stuff. You chair the International Greek New Testament Project, and you're a member of the Translation Oversight Committee for the ESV. Why don't you tell us a bit about one of those things, or a couple?
Tyndale House is a biblical studies research centre in Cambridge, England, and we have Britain's best library of the Bible. About 50 people on site every day researching the Bible at the doctoral level or above. So it's a pretty robust centre, and looking to do that in service of the church. So we're delighted to have people from around the world come and study here.
Amazing. So I've got an audience with people from all over the map. Quite a lot of the people watching are interested in Christianity, but maybe they have come in through Jordan Peterson. So they're of the opinion Christianity is interesting, but maybe they're not sure whether they should take the literal claims true of the New Testament, and maybe they're not sure whether it matters. So what I'm hoping to do in this stream is to dig in a bit to those questions, figure out what we actually know, what we can have confidence in, and then hopefully the significance of that will be apparent. So I thought I'd maybe ask with a broad question of, how do historians know anything? How do we know about the history at all?
Yeah, so I'd want to back up from that and say, how do humans know anything? Because I think the main way we know things is through personal relationship and testimony. So that's how I've never been to Antarctica, but I believe that such a place exists on the basis of testimony and people saying, there's a photo of Antarctica, and the social network in which I exist. And that's absolutely essential. And that's how science works. So although science involves experimentation, it's based on testimony, because you only ever do a tiny amount of the experiments for the things you believe in. You rely on the fact that the chemicals sent by someone else are correctly labeled. You rely on other people. The whole thing is a big social thing. Humans are social creatures, and that's how we know most of what we know. The thing about history, academic history, is it's an artificial thing, a bit like a hedge fund, where you've set up a system where the hedge fund managers aren't meant to lose whether the market goes up or down. And academic history is an intellectual exercise as to what we can verify together. Now, that's not so useful if you are trying to make a whole load of decisions, because, for instance, what the president of Russia might do next is something you can't prove, but you do need to make decisions about. Most of the time through the pandemic, we've had to make decisions before the science is actually in. And in all sorts of situations where someone might say be a victim of rape, that might be something that's true and you should act on and you should believe in, but couldn't be proven to a history department. And so that's where we got to, and I think sometimes what happens is people are looking to subject the Bible to the quite artificial exercise of a history department, which is a very good exercise, but it's just not the same as the way we live our lives.
Yes, that makes sense. So what's the process then by which a non-historian should go about investigating historic claims?
Well, I think you should look at the question of testimony. So how is it that we come to trust someone's word? And of course, we sometimes get these things wrong. And the Bible comes to us in the form of testimony. So, for instance, with the four Gospels, there isn't actually a lot about anyone in Galilee other than Jesus at the time of Jesus. I mean, they're just not lots of historical records sloshing around. Now you've got four Gospels, and they have some degree of independence from each other. At least John's different from the other three, and the other three aren't all totally interrelated. And so you can test them by each other, and you can test them against other things that we know at the time. And so that's the way you can test testimony. And that's the the right category, I think. So you get into it. You don't have to be in a rush. But say with the Old Testament, there's this guy called Abraham who's supposed to travel around. You're never going to find his tents. Tents don't last very long, and most of world history doesn't survive.
Yeah.
But there's something different, say, about the Old Testament. There's no national literature that is quite like it. It's the national literature of Israel that says as much negative about the people group from which it originates. It's not national propaganda. It's got a continuous history in terms of the way the narrative flows. It's got a lot of care about it. It's got a lot of moral balance about it. And it's got stuff that fits archaeologically because it talks about a number of different Assyrian kings, 5 in total. And the Bible was doing that before archaeology dug the remains of those kings out of the ground or any of their writings. So in fact, the Bible told you there was a guy called Sennacherib before the ancient Assyrian language was deciphered in the modern era, and he was found to be true. And he's at the right time period. So there are those sorts of things you can look at.
So if the documents that you're looking at and wondering whether they're true, new evidence appears and it confirms or backs up what those documents were saying, and that gives you reason to think that probably it was correct, not by coincidence, but because it was reporting actual history.
So, obviously a stop clock can be right twice a day, but if you were to get a 300-year-old Bible, any 300-year-old printed Bible, family Bible, whatever, and you can read lists of kings in it, that Bible exists before archaeology. Archaeology really begins 200 years ago with Napoleon Bonaparte taking experts with his army into Egypt. Maybe Thomas Jefferson did it slightly before in the US, but before that, people aren't digging things out of the ground. Then you get decipherment of Egyptian in 1822. You get other languages deciphered. That's when we get all this knowledge of the past. And so then you just run your test with my old family printed Bible, big fat black one or whatever it is that you find. Let's look at all the stuff that it's saying, and how much of that actually is fits with the modern era or archaeology. We got over 50 characters that are confirmed from texts outside the Bible of your 3,000 or so characters in the Bible. That's pretty good as a rate relative to other texts, given that something is so old. And if you say, I only trust the Bible when it's confirmed by something else, you're really saying you don't trust the Bible. It's a bit like me saying, to you, I won't only trust what you say when it's corroborated by someone else. So I'd want to say it's not that you expect everything in the Bible to be corroborated, but you just expect a sufficient amount. And then you say, yeah, okay, that seems rational to trust. There's, of course, all the miraculous stuff and the message we need to talk about, and that we can do. But I think from a historical point of view, that's what you do.
Let's start super skeptical and work towards, increasingly difficult questions of to prove. So could it be that the whole Bible was a very late forgery? Would it be possible that everything in the Bible that we have was planted in the ground 500 AD?
No. And and it's really simple to find out about that, which is, look, there's Judaism and their Christianity, and they're not the same thing. They have a relationship, but they're not the same thing. Go down to any synagogue, ask them what their books are, and basically you'll find that those books are what you would find in a Protestant or evangelical church in their Old Testament, exactly the same book. So clearly the Christians didn't come up with those books. They've been handed down in scrolls down the ages. So the Bible's divided into two parts, an Old and a New Testament. And yes, Christians are responsible for the New Testament. Of course, the earliest Christians were all Jews. But they're not responsible for the Old Testament. So there's not one group that's produced all of those books. So that's just at a very basic level. Something has to be explained there. You've got two groups of writing.
Even today, there's different groups in different parts of the world who continue to act believing one part or the whole of the Bible. Yeah. And you have to explain, how did that come about today? What's the sequence of how did these groups come about? You have to explain that.
It's unlikely, if you know anything about history, to think that the Christians and the Jews got together to falsify their Bible. And there's actually another group that's got the first 5 books that the Jews have, called the Samaritans. There's only about 400 of them left There may be 30,000 a century ago, and they have again, they've got their own first 5 books, and there's no way you can say, well, the Christians and the Samaritans and the Jews all got together and falsified them. It just doesn't make any sense. So you've got to look at the fact that the Bible, as we call it, is a group of books. Bible is actually originally a plural word. It's just been singular for the last 700 years. And that plurality has to be explained.
Okay, let's move back in time then. Could it be that, say, Paul and some of the so if we move past Jesus's death by let's say 50 years, perhaps what was just a fairly normal insurrectionist, his tale gets warped and twisted, and they decide they're going to make a new religion at that point. So early, but not during the crucifixion.
So I think the problem is that, say, with Tacitus, who's a Roman historian, he writes about the Great Fire in Rome in the year 64, when Nero blamed the Christians for having started the fire because he didn't want to get blamed himself. So already there, 1400 miles away from, I think it's 1400, something like that, away from Jerusalem, where Christianity starts, you've got large numbers of Christians in Rome, and Christianity spreads quite far and fast. I mean, as in Christian records and non-Christian records agree on that. So that's where it becomes difficult to have the really core stuff about the death and resurrection made up a long time later. That doesn't make any sense. In fact, this Roman historian, as well as Jewish sources, confirm that he was executed by the Romans. So that makes a lot of sense. And how did Romans execute people? They executed them on trees, that's what crucifixion is, execution on a tree. So then you've got this rather interesting thing that the Bible, which is divided into our 2 main sections, and the first bit, the Old Testament, is entirely written by Jews. Basically, your opening scene in the storyline there is a couple of humans at a tree taking a fruit, and it being a life and death question. Actually, the death penalty effectively for taking the fruit that God said they shouldn't take. And that's a sort of opening of a story. It's not the end of a story. It needs something to go after it. And part of it is a tragedy and things get bad. But what you find is the climactic scene in the New Testament, the bit written by Christians, is about this figure, Jesus, being killed on a tree and bringing life. Now, I'd want to say there's an awful lot of coherence to that storyline. And so to say, well, people were just artificially making up a story and they thought they'd create a religion doesn't really help you, because it doesn't explain how the first bit goes. And if you really wanted to start a religion, the very best thing is not to let your talented leader get killed by the Romans. That's just not a smart thing to do. And if he does, you don't have very long to make up your new religion before everyone's going to know that he's been dead and gone for a long time. So that's where it's really hard for me to conceive of the situation in which they're able to make up such a smart story. I mean, that people have been reading the Bible in loads of different countries down the ages and have seen a basic coherence to that. And even the conspiracy objection that it's all come out of the ground, the person who's made that has seen there's some coherence to the story.
Let's talk about the bit that people find really difficult to grasp if they're coming from a very materialistic worldview, which is the miracles, the claims of a supernatural existence. And they might say, well, I've never come across an explanation of the existence of the Bible and all these other things that explains the facts, as well as just believing that they're true. Yep. But I have this really strong prior belief that there's no such thing as a God, and therefore that should override. I just think there is an explanation out there. I don't know what it is, but it's better than the supernatural belief.
Yeah. So in other words, they've got a religion out there, and that religion involves something coming from nothing. Then it involves life coming from non-life, and it involves consciousness coming from non-consciousness. I mean, those are three quite big things. And, you know, you can debate the detail, and I'm not, particularly equipped on that, but they are things just at an instinctive level that are remarkable beliefs. And I think what happens is people talk as if the Christians are the only people with remarkable beliefs. And actually, there are remarkable beliefs on both sides. But again, the Christian comes back to the category of testimony. That with a miracle is not something that spoils the pattern of science. So, you know, people often think, well, you've got science, everything's lovely and predictable. And what religious people do is they're saying, well, everything's spooky, and there are fairies and there are pixies and there are angels and everything is just weird. Actually, Christians don't claim that. Christians claim that the miracles they believe in form a semantic pattern, a pattern of meaning. They actually point to something, so that the miracles you have in the Bible are ultimately pointing to Christ, to things about Jesus Christ, the things that he did, and so on, the things before him. And so it's not that God is interested in sort of, oh, that's a nice orderly pattern, like a crystalline structure, let's mess it up. Actually, what God is doing is signaling to us. And when people say, but I've never seen a miracle, but there's all sorts of things you've never seen that you believe in. If we all were surrounded by people in the planet, you know, who all believed that they had experienced miracles and we were the only one who didn't, we'd have no difficulty whatsoever in believing it. So because we're social creatures. Actually, it has been, let's think, Craig Keener did the study, didn't he, where he said 200 million people on the planet claim that they have directly experienced a miracle. Now, I'm not saying those are reliable. He's not saying they're reliable. He's just saying this idea that miracles are really rare is something that at least should be open to discussion. A lot is to do with the explanatory framework you already have. So a miracle given an atheist universe, if that's already a materialistic universe, is infinitely improbable. And so you apply the Sherlock Holmes rule that once you've eliminated the impossible, whatever is left, however improbable, must be the truth, and say, well, okay, can't be miracle. And so then you go on your thing, but you've really decided the prior rules. If you already believed that there was a God, and there's no evidence to show that believing in a God means you're not psychologically balanced, as psychologically balanced as this. If you already believe there's a God, and for instance, you already believe that he did great things to the Jewish people of Israel, then believing that he's done another thing and raised Jesus from the dead is not an exception. It's part of a pattern of behavior. Now, I don't understand anything about Bayesian probability, but I understand that this all relates to that, and that you can read Richard Swinburne's book all about that and the resurrection. In other words, your prior beliefs affect the probability of what you think after that, and that's really important to get. That's the way we work, and so that's why we find things believable or not. So with Christianity, there is a package. There's a meaning to life. There are things like guilt is real. There's some real morality out there. There's and it all comes together and it makes sense. And asking a Christian to, in a sense, show the plausibility of a tiny bit of their belief structure and not look at the whole in one go doesn't really make sense.
Because I think a lot of people have come to the conclusion that they have to believe in an objective morality. They just intuitively know that exists.
Yeah.
They find a lot of the ideas of there being a deity and there being a supernatural realm plausible at this point. But what they haven't reckoned with is, do they need to now readjust their assessment of some of the specific religious claims that they have previously dismissed? So I hope that some of the people watching are going to be doing that, watching this stream. I think another question people have in their mind is, did the New Testament canon come about through a selection process from from thousands of potential inclusions, where they sort of whittled it down to get what looked like a plausible story later. So maybe there was lots of documents that were nonsense, but then there was this kind of Machiavellian,
Yeah, well, I mean, I'd say the world's leading Bible skeptic, Bart Ehrman, whom I've debated, very capable debater, he does very well. But he would say that the 4 Gospels weren't selected out of a large number. Yes, there are other things that later on get called Gospels, but the 4 Gospels are clearly the earliest ones there are. Another scholar who's written on this, Charles E. Hill, wrote a book, I think, with Oxford University Press, Who Chose the Gospels, and really showing how no one chose the Gospels. This idea that some committee later on came and made decisions about the book doesn't really make sense, any more than saying that the umpires in the Olympics chose the winner of the marathon. I mean, they get involved if something goes wrong, but basically usually one person's way ahead of the others. It's not a photo finish, and there's no question about that. So I would say that with those books of the New Testament, they are the earliest books we have about Christianity. They come reasonably early, and they also, when our manuscripts show up, they start showing up together. There's a bit more to tell in terms of the story, because of course at first you don't have the technology to bind all of those books under a single cover, because you've got to make the multi-quire codex. That's the idea, that you've got lots and lots of different sort of sets of pages inset each other and sewn at the spine. It takes a while before you can do that. At first they just load them all inside each other, and then they have to sort of trim off the pages of the inner pages, because they just end up being too wide. So that those sort of technological things are going on. But the idea that there are 4 Gospels there is there before the first Roman emperor to convert to Christianity comes along. So that's Constantine. It's the 4 Gospels is accepted in southern Egypt, in France, and in Syria by about the year 200. You can show that.
I wonder if you could say a word or two comparatively for the documents of the New Testament versus other works of antiquity, in terms of the number of manuscripts and how confident we can be on the original words, and how early those manuscripts are.
Yeah. So I'd say, I mean, firstly, it's important to know it's not a competition. So if you just find an ancient letter from a son to his mother in Egypt, there's only one copy of it, but you have the original, and that, you don't need lots of copies of it. You just need one, and you know what he said to his mum. But what you've got with the New Testament is you don't have the first autograph, if you like, but you don't actually need them if people copy correctly. Just as when you're seeing me, you're not seeing the photo that my computer is registering. You're seeing a copy of a copy of a copy of a copy, and it's being copied many times before it gets to you, and our audio likewise. So we live in a society that is dependent on copying. That's how the phone works and the internet works, and that's how ancient societies also worked. So there were scribes, there were lots of people who spent their time copying. Copying sometimes can involve miscopying, but most of the time it's correct. So I'd say all sorts of ancient literature, classical literature, religious literature, Quran, Chinese literature, biblical literature has been well transmitted in general terms. So that's just the first thing to say. But yes, of course, when you compare the New Testament with most classical works, you're going to find that there are more copies of it, because it had greater cultural importance for more time. There were more scribes. And with the New Testament, for instance, it's written in Greek, but then it gets translated into Syriac, into Latin, into Coptic, into Armenian, into Georgian, into Anglo-Saxon, into Gothic, into Old Church Slavonic, and right the way through. And if I wanted to change the Bible at any one stage, I'd have to go to all of those places. And remember, printing hasn't yet been invented. I'd have to persuade or somehow cajole scribes into changing things. I mean, people have never been that unified that it would be possible to do that. So I just think that that's where what we've got is we've got a vast number of copies of the New Testament, and you can look at the differences there are between them.
My observation is that the more people know about the topic, if they're skeptical, the closer their story ends up being to Orthodox Christianity anyway. So.
Oh, totally. Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I've got a whole shelves of books behind me on the text of the New Testament. And, what we're finding here is that sorry, that probably looks strange on screen, but, it's not that they're all saying totally different things about the what we've got in terms of copies and manuscripts. There's an awful lot of unity there. Yeah.
I've got a couple of questions that I had people send me before the stream. So one of them is, manuscript errors have historically been rather innocuous scribal mistakes. However, modern times have seen the discovery of manuscripts with what would appear to be much more significant discrepancies, some of which have been adopted as authoritative in popular translations. For example, Jesus instead of God in Jude 5, Son instead of God in John 1:18. Should we shun modern scholarship's attempts to correct the traditionally received texts, or should we embrace these discoveries?
Those are two wonderful examples. And you know what? What's really interesting about those two things is Jesus instead of the Lord or God in Jude is the only difference is one letter. Because what would happen in those days is when you wrote the name Jesus or God or Lord, you would write, for Lord, it'd be kurios is the Greek word. You got a K and an S. You just write the first and last letter. For Jesus, it's an I and an S. And the K has an upright, just as the I has an upright. And they're just minimally different. So I think that's pretty good evidence that this is a case where it could easily be an accidental change. Likewise, in John 1:18, is it the one and only God or the one and only Son? And the word Son is huios, so it begins with an upsilon, ends with a sigma, and the word God is theos, begins with a theta, ends with a sigma. The only difference is the first letter. The only difference. So they're one letter difference in both cases. So yes, it's significant. And we're editing a Greek New Testament here at Tyndale House, and we decided to go with Son actually in our first edition, and probably in our second edition we may well go with God on John 1:18, because it is that finely balanced. And I have expert friends who are Christians, are very positive about the Bible, who've got different views about that one in Jude. Again, it's finely balanced, but again, the truth or not of the text or the validity of Christianity does not depend on that. And Christians are prepared to advertise that, because Christians have always known that there are differences in copies. St. Augustine, 1600 years ago, knew about that. In fact, Christians even are so proud of them, they even put footnotes nowadays telling you about these differences. So it's not that that in any way invalidates Christianity, because the belief that God's given us these books isn't dependent on us having perfect copies of them. So I'd want to say that even a bad translation or a bad copy in the Middle Ages is still sufficiently close to what God gave that it's a very powerful thing. So it's people sometimes treat the Bible as a bit like a magic thing, and so that when you say, if you got one bit miscopied, then it's invalidated. So it's a bit like, if you say diagonally instead of diagonally, and the spell doesn't work. I mean, this is the thing about magic charms. They just don't work if you get the word slightly wrong. And I think of it much more like uranium. I mean, you don't think because it's not 100% enriched, nothing's going to happen. And so I think a metaphor for the power of God's word.
What a great example.
Yeah, it needs to be, you've got to use the right metaphor, if that makes sense.
Maybe it's worth briefly talking about the concept of inerrancy, because I think that plays in where people are holding scripture to this standard of every word is God breathed, and therefore we surely should know every word, and if there's any even marginal contradiction, then the whole thing collapses.
Yeah, so I think people have often got confused about this. So the belief in scriptural inerrancy, which I think is an important belief, is the belief that God doesn't make any error, and that he wrote scripture and he's trustworthy. And it's a simple thing like this. I mean, trustworthy people don't lie. I mean, if you trust, I mean, the idea that God can sometimes just say the wrong thing rather undermines the idea that you can, trust him and have a relationship with him as a trustworthy being. So that's really important. That's very different from the question of copying. I mean, if copyists were never to make errors, are you saying that if you were trying to make an error and, you know, that your hand would be grabbed by some invisible force that would prevent it from miscopying something? And the idea that we ought always to be able to identify God's words, again, isn't really valid. And the reason why is this: you think about it, that what you're saying is, if I listen to a talk and there's one phrase I didn't get, the whole thing's invalid. Or if I listen to a speech or a film or whatever it is, that's not the way communication works. And for you know, someone's giving a long complaint to you and there's one bit that you mishear and you say, well, I'm not going to accept that complaint because I missed that one bit. It's not very socially acceptable. So I'd want to say that with the whole question of God's the idea of scripture being, let's say, 66 books in the Bible, is they are coherent together but also independent. So let's say John's gospel was written in Ephesus in Turkey, let's say. I mean, it's widely held. The day after it's written, the people back in Jerusalem don't know it's been written, and they don't need it to have been written for them to understand the scrolls and the books they already have. That's so it's important to realize that it's not all an all or nothing thing in that sense, that each communication comes to you and you don't need to have had all of them to have got a sense of them. I mean, maybe it's like Jordan Peterson videos. I mean, who's watched all of them? No one. But there's overlap between them, so that's maybe a bad thing. But you can get the drift as well. And I think that's where God's given this, say, 75 hour long set of texts. That's what they would be in read out loud in English, and they are coherent, but there's plenty of puzzles in there. Not everything's simple to understand, but actually in normal life you don't give up because things are hard to understand. There are things in physics where, general relativity and quantum mechanics, people say, I don't really get how that all fits together. They don't give up on that. They just scratch their heads and keep going on and study more. And so a lot of it is, if we're talking about a being who knows everything, guess what? He might be able to say some things that would be puzzling to you. That's okay. Now, if none of it were making sense, if it were unfruitful, it's like pushing spaghetti uphill. There was no intellectual satisfaction. Everything was just more and more mystery. You should get worried, And, if you were doing a physics degree and none of it was making sense, then you should get really worried. But actually, a lot of it does make sense. And it makes more sense the more you think about it. So you press on. And yes, you haven't quite reconciled everything into a grand universal theory, but that's okay because enough of it makes sense. And so it is believable that ultimately it will make more sense.
If you had a magic wand and could clear up one variant, one sort of question that you have in your mind, what would it be? If you could I think it would be really quite fun to know for sure, for instance, if Mark's gospel ended at 16 verse 8 and what is that going on? That was actually my next question, was about the end of Mark. I mean, that would be a really neat one. I mean, and it's not just whether it ends there, but what one's take on it should be if it ends there. So that's Would you hesitate before preaching on, taking as your text
I wouldn't preach on those final verses because I want to preach about things that are definite. And there are so many texts in the Bible that are not disputed. I have not yet preached on. The other thing is, I do think that the idea that those verses are uncertain is not a new thing. It's actually something that's been around for a very long time. Some of our earliest manuscripts. There's actually a project I'm involved in as an advisor called the Mark 16 Project, which is bringing together all of the different manuscripts visually online in all the different languages, so you can see those things together. Claire Cleaver out of Switzerland is heading that up, and that would be a fun thing to do.
how much do you think there's value in lay people, normal members of congregations becoming interested in things like looking at actual manuscripts, learning Greek, all these kinds of things?
Lots. So I think they say a little knowledge is a dangerous thing, but that's not a problem, provided you know you've got a little knowledge, and provided you are surrounded by lots of other people who have knowledge. So, for instance, if I would start spouting pandemic, actually, there's a load of people who know about pandemics. I know there's lots we don't know, but everyone's got an opinion on it. And if I were to start spouting on diets, right, very quickly, lots of people have opinions on that. So that's where I think a little knowledge, and I've got a little knowledge of pandemics, I've got a little knowledge of diet, and just about every parent has to read tins and their ingredients sometimes, feel responsible. I think that is really worthwhile. And you can use your knowledge positively, for instance, to trace verbal links across text, which can be a very interesting thing. So at the end of John 2, Jesus doesn't trust himself because he knows what's in man, and the next word at the beginning of John 3 is there was a man, and just seeing, oh yeah, that's the same word, it's picked up. Now that may be there already in the English, but it's once you've seen it in the Greek, you say, okay, it's definitely there. That's worth doing, and a little knowledge is fine. Dabbling is fine, provided you know you're dabbling and you're not trying to create and sell something and spread something. So if you start dabbling and then start writing for wide consumption, no, this is problematic. Or if you start dabbling and coming up with your original take on things, that's problematic. But if you're dabbling and then using it to sort of just follow what different authorities are saying in their argument, that's fine and good. I feel it's like grinding your coffee fresh, or people have got more scientific about coffee in recent decades, and I think being quite analytical about the Bible can be very, very helpful. Just give you a more solid sense of what you're talking about.
Is there, and do you think there could be a negative aspect though, where people, well, let me dovetail that in with another related question, because we've got lots of people in our community, my viewers and such, who are from different denominations, and one of the questions that we talk about quite a bit is how significant is it to be constantly talking about the differences versus talking about the things that are shared, like truths that we can all acknowledge. So likewise, is it more important for people to spend their time thinking about the very obvious practical things that they can apply to their life, rather than worrying about all these issues about
well, I think a lot of it is about just keeping things in the right proportion, and so keeping the main thing. And I mean, we take a lot of care sometimes over our food. Okay, there are times when we just throw things together and it's just a quick lunch, and then there are other times when it really matters to get it right. And I think it's the same thing with sometimes you really need to go into a subject, and the details matter, and you've got to get them in the right proportion. So I'll give you an example. I mean, I'm very, pro-Ukraine at the moment. I think Russia's done a terrible thing, and that's the sort of big picture level. Then there's a question like, is Ukraine in the right position when it releases its prisoners so they can fight? Well, that's their call. I'm not going to judge it. Let's see what happens. But you can get more and more into details, and that's where you still got to just zoom out and say, look, they're on the right side. As far as I'm concerned, they just deserve every bit of backing and praise and encouragement that they can have, and practical thing in this terrible situation. Of course, there are loads of different takes on Russia, and I understand that, and what NATO has been and done, and I get all that, but they're still the big thing at the moment. And so for me, a lot of it is about just seeing things in the right proportion, but everything has detail that you can go down into, including how an individual situation is treated.
Yeah, there's a question I've got Well, a couple of questions relating to historiography around that time. One of which is saying, how does the New Testament writings compare to other historiography from the same time period? And then the other one is, does the New Testament actually influence historiography? Does it have an influence on future manuscripts?
Yeah, so I mean, the main writers you've got who are Jewish that survive at the time, writing in Greek, you've got Josephus. So he's born about the year 37, dies about the year 100. We don't know for sure. And he's writing towards the end of the 1st century, things about the Jewish war and history of the Jews and so on. You got Philo, who's more closer to the time of Jesus, let's say born around the year 20, we don't really know, dies around the year 50, again, we don't really know, 20 BC and 50. And he does most of it's Bible interpretation, but he does a little bit of, things that this went on stuff. Then you go to Hebrew, where you got lots later sources. You got the Jewish Talmud and things like that, and that's not really historiography of the same kind. So I'd say that the New Testament writings are relatively unusual, and it's also unusual to have that much about anyone. So I'd say you've got more words effectively about Jesus than you have about the Roman emperor at the time of Jesus, Tiberius. You've got more words in, say, Mark's gospel, our shortest gospel, than you have in Augustus's own account of all that he did. So there's a lot of material there. So I'd say there's an embarrassment of riches that we have in the case of Jesus. Pretty unusual for someone who's not from Roman elite. I mean, that's what people used to write biographies of. We've got a number of biographies, actually, not Jewish biographies, but the Plutarch has got lots and lots of parallel lives. So this guy did this and this guy did that. So, it's like Alexander the Great and Julius Caesar. Let's write two biographies, like comparing them. And he does lots of that sort of thing. But again, it's not that you've got vast numbers of biographies of any of these individuals.
I know you've got to shoot off fairly soon. Yeah. Shall I maybe ask one more question?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. So this from Nathan, who asks, you've mentioned the Gospels a lot. So I was wondering about the rest of the New Testament, both in terms of how it supports the witness of the Gospels, but also for its own veracity.
Yeah, so I mean, you've only got one mainly historiographical book there, which is the Book of Acts, and the Book of Acts does really well because clearly the author needed to have traveled around the Mediterranean in order to write that in detail, the different political systems you have in the different cities that Paul visits. Now, without the internet back then, actually getting relatively trivial information becomes difficult, but you get the most detailed shipwreck described in any ancient text in Acts 27. You get visits to Cyprus, to Turkey, Greece, Italy, Malta. They all turn up very well, really. So
with local details that turn out to be correct.
And it's all remarkable. With Paul's letters, what you've got is you actually have a dovetailing of them with the narrative in Acts. So there's a coherence between where he says in letters, what he says he's doing in letters, with what's actually going on in Acts. You can look at, for instance, a collection of money that he's taking for people in Jerusalem, and these details dovetail, and those being pointed out for the last 200 years or more, in such a way that yes, there is some. You'd have to have an amazing depth of conspiracy to bring that all together, and something unparalleled in literature that I know of.
So you've got two choices: either you believe in a giant conspiracy throughout hundreds of years, involving most parts of the entire world where humans were living.
Yeah.
Or you just think that maybe it was actually what happened, and these texts should be taken at face value.
And I think the only sort of conspiracies you should go for are really simple conspiracies. So if, for instance, conspiracies of silence are simple conspiracies. A whole load of people are cowardly and keep their mouths shut about something. That's not. There's got one explanation, that we're just not very brave. That's fine. But when you start getting this sort of level of intricacy of all sorts of people,
yeah, you'd need an enormous administrative machine operating completely in silence.
Yeah, it just doesn't work.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for joining me. That was incredible.
Thank you for doing what you're doing.
Yeah, thank you very much.